For those of you who don't know me or know us, my name is Alice Tipping, and I lead the work at the ISD on fisheries subsidies. So we have been following the negotiations going on at the WTO extremely closely over the last few years. And what we thought would be useful at the beginning of this year, 2021, is to run two webinars, the first of which we ran last week, which look at essentially sort of where we're at in the negotiations. So yesterday morning was very much a sort of state of play review. Where are we at with the actual negotiating text? And we found, I think, through that process that the text is significantly advanced. It's actually already dealt with and clarified a number of the relatively smaller technical issues that we've seen in these negotiations. That's across the three substantive pillars. So prohibiting subsidies to IUU fishing, prohibiting, excuse me, subsidies to overfished stocks, and lastly, the idea of developing options to prohibit subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, which of course is the key language in the mandate that WTO ministers set for us all. And so after that, what we thought would be useful for you as negotiators is to ask the scientific community, those who we thought had sort of the most specific data to offer, to look back into their data and to try and give us even an approximate sense of how much fishing effort, how much fishing capacity, what proportion of global subsidies could potentially be covered by some of the prohibitions and the exceptions that we're talking about, particularly in the last substantive pillar, in the pillar on overcapacity and overfishing. So what we have over the next 2 hours is a set of 4 very data-intensive presentations. We're going to hear first from Anthony Rogers from Sea Change Economics, and we've asked him to look at information provided by Global Fishing Watch. Many of you will be familiar with this website. It monitors vessels, global fishing by vessels that have automatic identification systems installed. And the beauty of that data is that if you know how to use it, as Anthony does, you can see exactly where these vessels fish to quite a detailed degree of precision. So we've asked him to look at that data and help us to understand, for this level of fishing, not very small scale, but relatively commercial and particularly large scale fishing, where does it take place geographically across territorial seas, EEZs, and on the high seas? We're then going to hear from Deng Palomares from the University of British Columbia, who has extracted for us, from the Sea Around Us catch database, so database of global catch and its assessments, data that shows us where global catch comes from in terms of geographic areas, and in terms of scales of fishing. So artisanal versus larger scale fishing, and inshore versus EEZ fishing. So that it's not an absolutely precise kind of match onto what the exceptions are proposing, but we think it's a useful proxy. It's a useful sense of scope of how much fishing catch some of these exceptions to subsidization might cover. We're actually going to pause after those first 2 presentations to give some time for questions and discussion, because I'm conscious there's a lot of data in there. So we're going to pause after those 2 first presentations, and then we're going to actually have a video presentation by Anna Schubauer. Many of you will know her name already, also from the university, or formerly from the University of British Columbia. And the research that she has done looks at how global subsidies, based on Rashid Soumaila's estimates, divide up between artisanal fishing and larger scale fishing. And this is research that she's done based on the latest update of Rashid Soumaila's figures. And we know that for some members don't agree entirely with those figures, at least as they apply to their own particular subsidization programs. But we think this is useful data because it gives, as an overall perspective, a sense of global scale of how, based on the best scientific estimates we have at the global level, what percentage of subsidies go to larger scale fishing versus smaller scale fishing, and how much of that is provided by developing countries and how much by developed countries. So we're going to have a video presentation by Anna, and then the last presentation we have is by Yannick Rousseau from the University of Tasmania, based in Hobart, and he has extracted for us, from data he has on fishing capacity and fishing effort, information essentially about the split of fishing capacity between artisanal and larger scale fishing at a global level, and a sense from data on fishing effort about where some of this fishing takes place geographically, so how close to shore it happens, in broad categories. And we'll pause again, obviously, for discussion and questions after the video presentation and after Yannick's presentation. The first thing I have to acknowledge is that firstly, we're extremely grateful to all of these researchers for the work they've put into this. What we've asked them to do is not simply present research that they've already done, which is relatively easy, but actually to do new research that extracts and calculates brand new data from data sets that they already have. So I'm extremely grateful for the time and attention they've spent to produce this new data for us and for you. I'm particularly grateful on a personal note to Anthony and Deng, who are awake at midnight on the west coast of North America. And Yannick, of course, is awake rather after working hours also in Hobart. So deep gratitude from our perspective for both their professional and their personal commitment to this particular effort. With that out of the way, yes, in fact, a good point Tristan has just reminded me of. Deng and Anthony, if you would like to leave and go to bed after the discussion of your two presentations, we will absolutely understand. We know that you probably have a big work day on Friday ahead of you. So if you'd like to leave us at that point, once the questions and answers have happened on your presentations, please feel free. If you're fascinated and would like to stay for the next two presentations, that's fine too. Other than that, I think that's probably all of the useful introduction I can give at this point. So perhaps the next thing I'll do is ask Anthony, if you'd like to take the floor, please. I'll stop sharing my screen and feel free to share yours and put your video on if it works and if you feel comfortable.
Sure, let me get this working. Fix that. There we go. And there we are. Look good?
Yep, perfect.
Great.
Take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Anthony Rogers. I am a resource economist. I've been an economist for almost 15 years, and 10 of which has been focused on fisheries and other ocean resources. And today I'm going to present an analysis of global fishing effort data from Global Fishing Watch, which we'll talk about in a second, based on satellite data, which may be useful throughout these discussions. That did not change. There we go. So before I jump into the data, I'll tell you a little bit about what this information is. The data comes from an organization called Global Fishing Watch, many of you are familiar with. It is, as Alice said, I took some prior analysis and reused it and cut it in a few different ways to present some new data. And so this is, I tried to keep it as recent as I had, which is 2019 data. I don't think there may be 2020 data for Global Fishing Watch now, but I'm not totally sure about that. In any case, all vessels over a certain size are equipped with satellite tracking system called AIS. Many, but not all, have another one called VMS. Global Fishing Watch data uses this data to basically track or look at where fishing vessels are operating globally. These systems are primarily set up for navigation and to avoid collisions at sea, but they've cleverly figured out, oh, we can look at them and look at their actual fishing effort, which has been great for researchers like me. The database contains about 300,000 vessels. So that's a little more than 10% of the total estimated number of fishing vessels globally. However, these are all the large industrial vessels that have satellite tracking. And so it covers a fairly significant proportion of fisheries catch and overall fishing effort. This database has, for example, more than half of all fishing effort that is more than 100 nautical miles from shore. It contains as much as 80% of all the fishing that happens on the high seas. So while the vessel count is relatively low. It covers a significant amount of total global fishing effort. The last thing I want to just remind myself, I put here to remember, is that the analysis, when the analysis is based on the designation of the vessel's country of is whichever flag the vessel is flying. So when we specify country of origin or region, that's where that information comes from. So with that, this is what kind of analysis is possible with Global Fishing Watch. I've taken this is just a look at the amount of all effort that is on the high seas. On the left side, this is everything globally, so everybody together. You can see more than 13% on the top right column, more than 13% of all hours fishing were spent on the high seas. I should note this data only covers active fishing hours. So anytime transiting or drifting or anything else that's not actively fishing is not included in this fishing hours amount. It is purely they are actually operating and fishing. We also have a kilowatts per hour amount. This is basically the amount of energy these vessels expend to fish. It's sort of a different way to track effort. And we can see in the bottom right there that that all high seas fishing expended about 23% of all the energy expended in this entire data set. On the right, I have a regional breakdown of the same data with vessels. You can see, like at the top, for example, vessels flagged to Asian countries have by far the highest percentage of fishing hours and fishing and energy expended on the high seas. You should note that sort of middle column, the percent of regional effort means percentage of all fishing effort from vessels flagged to that region. So for example, all fishing by, let's say, European vessels, there's a little of all the effort by European vessels globally, a little over 3% of it occurs on the high seas. So next, here we have the same sort of breakdown, but in addition to the high seas effort, I've also added in fishing effort for all fishing that occurred in the EEZ that was different from the vessel's own. So in other words, when a vessel was fishing within a foreign EEZ. We can see here that globally on the left, 25% of all fishing hours was spent in these two categories, foreign EEZs and on the high seas, and 41% of all energy expended. And then once again, on the right, I have a regional breakdown of the same amounts. Now, I was asked for part of this analysis to look at a few potential exemptions that have been under consideration. And so the first one I was asked to look at was fishing effort within domestic territorial seas of all developing nations that are WTO members. So we could see that this covers about 20 on the left, 20% of all fishing hours and almost 10% of kilowatt hours. Once again, there's a regional breakdown on the right. As you look at this, for clarity, I wanted to note that the developing nation effort attributed in Europe is because Turkey is designated as part of Europe and the regional categorization used here. I also do want to confirm the very bottom right that Oceania's global effort numbers here are rounded. They were such a tiny fraction of global effort that I think there were 5 or 6 significant digits. So that this is accurate. It's, yeah. The next exception I was asked to look at was fishing effort within the entire EEZ, so all the way through 200 nautical miles of developing nations, excluding China. This, therefore, just noting this does include most of the data that was in the previous slide. That's the territorial sea effort as well. And noting here, what's interesting is despite the expanded miles covered, the percent of global fishing hours only covers a little less than 10% of total global fishing hours, and is still roughly about the same as 10%. Here, I'll go back for just a second to look. See, the kilowatt hours is almost the same either way. Give everyone a moment to look at the regional amounts if you like. Now the last one I was asked to look at was look at all fishing effort for LDCs, so least developed countries. Here, global fishing hours are less than a single percent and just about 1% of kilowatt hours. This wasn't exactly surprising to me. As I said, this database mostly tracks very large industrial vessels, and very few of those, I believe, are flagged to LDCs. And I omitted a regional breakdown in this particular category because that didn't quite make sense the same way it did previously. And then this last one, I took the three previous and combined them all. So you could see what the combined amount here is. Note these totals are slightly less than just adding the previous slides together, as there is some overlap in coverage, particularly the first two. But it's interesting to see that global fishing hours in these exceptions is more than 26.5%, and kilowatt hours is over 18%. And that is it for the analysis I've done.
Can you hear me?
We can, yes, and we can see your slides perfectly. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So, good evening, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. I am Deng Palomares, and I work at the Sea Rounders. I've been with the Sea Rounders since 2001, and prior to that, I was with FishBase at the World Fish Center. So I have been asked to extract data from the sea around us. The sea around us is an information system of the world's maritime fisheries catches that had been reconstructed to include all fish sectors, from subsistence, recreational, artisanal, and industrial. And this is a work that has been the product of over 20 years of research that was started by our principal investigator, Dr. Diane Pauly. And this set of slides that I'm going to present tonight is very new. We have just updated our database to 2018, and the last quality control finished last week. And so I was able to provide the slides tonight for tonight's presentation. Okay. Next slide. So first I was asked to look at artisanal catches by WTO member countries as against the global total catches. So we are talking of 66 years of catch. And for this particular slide, it's artisanal catches make up 17% of the world's fisheries catches that is accumulated over 66 years. But in 2018, artisanal catches made up 22% of the global catches, and that represented 14% of the global economic value of the catch. Now, the economic value of the catch is obtained from Rashid Somaila's price database, which we have also integrated into the Sea Around Us. And this way we can just multiply the value of 1 ton of a specific taxon with the catch of that taxon in a country. And this is how we get this data. The global catches over 66 years, accumulated to 6 billion tons, and that's averaging about 90 million tons per year. And the artisanal catches of WTO member countries make up 1/6 of the global at just over 1 billion tons during the 66-year period, averaging at 16 million tons per year. In 2018, these artisanal catches represented 15% of, in developing countries, represented 15% of the global catch and 10% of the global economic value of that catch. Now, there are some areas where you have, where we will see that, for example, in South America, this is actually driven by the dominance of the Peruvian anchoveta, both in catch and in value. The artisanal catches in the inshore fishing areas, this time of the WTO member countries, make up 35% of the global artisanal catch for the 66-year period. However, in 2018, that made up 16% of global catches and 14% of the global economic value of the catch. Here we present things, the data in inshore fishing areas. And the definition of inshore fishing areas, or IFAs, is from the shore to 50 kilometers offshore, or about 200 meters depth contour, whichever comes first. Now, territorial seas is most likely half of the IFA. Yeah. Okay, I go to the next one. In 2018, the artisanal fleets in the IFAs of WTO member countries totaled to 60 million tons and 4.5 trillion USDs. And the domestic IFA catch by developing country artisanal fleets represented 10% of the global catch. Again, I'm showing how the Peruvian catch of anchoveta for fish meal is dominating this. I forgot to mention that we were not asked for this, but we could also provide whether the catch, what is the end use of the catch? So we could see whether it's going to fish meal or to human consumption or to other uses. But yeah, it was not something that was required, so I did not put all of that in. The aggregate catch for all fleets in the inshore fishing areas in 2018 alone stood at 36 million tons, economic value of 22 trillion USD. And for developing countries, this represented 21% of the global catch and 54% of the global economic value of the catch. That is including anchoveta. Catch across all fishing sectors in WTO member countries in 2018 totaled to 106 million tons, and that for the least developed countries represented 6.8% of the global catch, while least developed countries represented 2.7% of the global economic value of the catch. Now, going into the aggregated catch of all fleets in WTO member countries, but excluding China and catches within their EEZs in 2018, that amounted to 75 million tons without China. And for developing countries, that represents 42% of the global catch in 2018 and 23% of the global economic value of the catch. And just an aside, the aggregate catch of China inside its own EEZ in 2018 made up 9.7% of global catches in EEZs. Global catches in EEZs. But that only made 7.6% of the world's maritime fisheries catches. And the values are written there. I think that's the end of my slide. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Anna Schubauer. This is a pre-recorded presentation due to some time zone challenges. And I will be presenting about our study that was published last year about the global fisheries subsidy divide between the small-scale fisheries and the large-scale fisheries at a global scale. And I'm working very closely with the University of British Columbia, the Fisheries Economic Research Unit, as well as with IISD. So I'm not going to spend much time on the method, but we'll focus on our analysis and the results. So, but just for you to have an idea, we focused on the definition of small-scale fisheries based on each country, and we used each country's subsidy data and looked into which part was provided to the small scale over the large scale sector. And we assessed 61 countries, which provided 92% of the global subsidies, and the rest we built a model and used averages to estimate the whole all of the marine countries. So our results show that 19% out of the 35 billion US dollars is provided to the small scale fishing sector and 81% to the large scale. We divide those into capacity, ambiguous and beneficial subsidies. And here you can see in the graph that they make up very similar percentages. So the largest share is provided as capacity enhancing, both for the large scale as well as for the small scale. What does this actually mean? So we're looking into large-scale fishers compared to the small-scale fishers. And it turns out when we estimated by number of fishes that a large-scale fisher would receive around 4 times more money than a fisher in a small-scale fisheries. If we look at the landed value, at the dollar landed, it would be twice as much. And so it shows a clear inequity. And we argue that it undermines the economic viability of small-scale fisheries, especially in the long term. So here I just did a divide by region for you to see what's going on with the different regions in the world. So we have Asia. We took China out of Asia as it's quite a large entity and provides a lot of subsidies in total for this graph. So we can see China provides the smallest share of small-scale fishery subsidies, whereas Africa provides the largest share. So it's interesting to see that the countries providing the smaller amount of total subsidies providing the largest share to the small-scale counterparts. And yeah, so in conclusion, the majority of subsidies are going towards large-scale capacity enhancing subsidies. So that is the biggest share of them all. We also looked into developing versus developed countries, as well as into low HDI countries or high HDI countries, and looking that the small-scale fisheries of the low HDI countries, of the more of the developing countries, receive the smallest share of beneficial subsidies. So the largest scale of capacity enhancing of the harmful subsidies go to large-scale fisheries, and the smallest share of the good of the beneficial subsidies is for the small-scale fisheries. So there's obviously something that needs rectifying to have small and large-scale fisheries on a more even playing field. And so capacity enhancing subsidies have also increased since 2009, not only to the global total, but also specifically for small-scale fisheries, and especially in developing low HDI countries. So they're providing more and more harmful fishery subsidies instead of more beneficial subsidies. And in total, we say that eliminating overall capacity enhancing subsidies would impact the small scale fisheries less than the large scale fisheries. So by impact, it's obviously the amount of money we're looking into here. And if we take all harmful subsidies away, the large-scale fisheries would suffer more. And if we take those away, the impact on the more impoverished small-scale fisheries would be good, because again, it evens the playing field a little bit more. So it's understandable that small-scale fishing want to help with short-term needs, and so it's also understandable that we think we need to keep supporting them, but we also think that that should be a focus of redirecting subsidies in the long term and have a transition away from the harmful subsidies and do something that helps them more. In this way, we need to focus on food security and the maintenance of livelihoods, which should be in the foreground, and capacity enhancing subsidies are not the solution to do that. Also, funds currently used for those capacity subsidies could be redirected, as I just said, with long-term goals in mind. So we want to look into projects for coastal communities that help them to achieve social equity, economic viability and resilience, or even other things. Maybe they need schools, they may need roads. It doesn't have to be money that needs to be provided directly into fishing, but it could also be useful for other projects and other needs that communities have. So I did a little bit of an extra analysis here that we didn't do for the original study. And we looked into what subsidy types could be relevant to the WTO negotiations right now. Those different subsidy types are kind of defined a little bit different based on our UBC study and based on what how the WTO defines them. So there might be some overlap. So this is not a clear categorization, but we did our best to reflect what of these subsidies are actually relevant right now in these negotiations. So the total of these is 17.6 billion to both large and small scale combined. And so we looked into a little bit the exception scenarios to the small scale sector. So which exception could apply? And first of all, if no exception is, then we have 100% of the total, the 17.6 billion US dollars that will need to be removed. If we look into an exception of small scale fishing of the WTO developing countries or the WTO members, which are developing countries, we would see that only 5% of this whole total would be a carve out. If we look at all WTO members and the small scale sector, we can see that 11%, $2 billion would be accepted, would be taken away from the total of the 17.6 billion. So I split this out into regions, so we could see that on the left-hand side, those are the 0.9 billion US dollars to the developing countries. The largest share would be Asia, then Africa, then South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and then North America. If we look into the 2 billion of all small-scale fisheries WTO members, again, Asia is the largest share, but then here Europe comes into play, as it's not, at most European countries are not developing countries. That shows here quite clearly. And then North America and then Africa. And then if we look into the fisheries subsidy to the least developed countries, on the left-hand side again, this is the total 17.6 billion, only 0.3 billion is going to least developed countries. And these are both small and large scale fisheries. And again, if we break this down by region, Oceania, South America, the Caribbean is a smaller share, so you can't really see how they're divided, but Africa and Asia are most divided 50-50. So a total of 154 million is to the small scale sector and 144 million to the large scale sector of all least developed countries. Yeah, so as this is pre-recorded, I won't be able to answer any questions for you right now, but I really strongly encourage you. You can use my Twitter or my email. I'll leave this on here for a moment, and you can send me any questions that you have. I don't know, maybe IASD will also circulate this presentation as a PDF, or you can send me an email. I'm happy to share it. Also, if you would like a copy of the study, I'm happy to send you a PDF version of it. And yeah, that's it for me for now. Thank you for listening, and yeah, Take care, everybody. Stay safe. Goodbye.
I'm just going to close all of that. I hope you can see the slides and only the slides.
Yep, they look great. Take it away.
Cool. So I'm Yannick, and I am a researcher at the University of Tasmania in Australia, and I focus on global fishing fleets, artisanal, industrial, and everything to do with the capacity, the number of boats, drivers, the efforts, catch per unit of effort, and so on and so forth. And I'm just going to give you a quick or not so quick overview of the global fishing fleets, and then to move on towards the WTO exemptions and what they mean. First, I need to actually, that's working, thank you. As we're talking quite a lot with the other presenters, there's not really any definition of what artisanal is, and each country got their own, and each study got their own. I was actually quite surprised to see that we almost all used the same definition, which was to use the definition of the countries. In my case, I make no difference between the different terms: artisanal, small scale, subsistence, and non-commercial. Mostly because I have found that when the boats are involved, there is very little difference in all these terms, and also because quite a lot of them are language dependent. So I have used the legal definition of what is an artisanal boat in this study, but in cases where it was not really applicable, for instance, in cases where the definition was based on the distance to the shore or on the amount of catch they were allowed to have or something like that, I used a more sensible approach, which was usually to use another country as a proxy. Would consider that the fleets of South Asia, for instance, would be similar and have a similar definition of what artisanal is. And again, and that was, I guess, the same for every study. Like what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the word artisanal is valid only for this study and the very specific proxies that I'm using. So overview of the global fishing fleet. In the last 70 years, we can see that the fishing fleet has more than doubled, going from 1.8 million fishing vessels in the marine, so in the ocean, in 1950 to over 3.5 million in 2017. And at the current growth rate, we could expect another 200,000 vessels to be added to the global marine fishing fleet by the end of 2030. Obviously, this is just a trend, and it depends a lot of what will be the management and whatever can happen in the global economy and things like that. For instance, that did not take into account COVID, and I have no idea what was the effect of COVID on global fishing efforts. That said, well, we can see that this vast increase in fleets has really not been homogeneous throughout the world. In the 50s, most of the fleet was in Europe, Northeast Asia, and Southeast Asia. They were making about 3/4 of the fishing fleet. While in 2020, Southeast Asia is taking the lion's share of the number of vessels globally, with Indonesia and the Philippines actually driving the fishing fleet of Southeast Asia. And I think together they're about 1/5 of the global fishing fleet. When considering the engine power of that fleet, the trend is relatively similar. It has increased almost consistently since 1950 with some bumps here and there. And again, it's expected to increase actually at maybe a faster rate than it has before. And again, it's a bit difficult to predict, even more so than the number of vessels, because it does depend a lot on increasing technology and management, which are very, very difficult to predict. So if we go back to have a comparison of the number of vessels and how they have evolved. So we're saying that actually the Southeast Asia has taken up most of the fleet of the world. But when we actually compare these numbers, the number of vessels to the engine power, we can see that the share of engine power of different regions has changed quite differently. In the 50s, Europe and North America were the most of the engine power of the fishing fleets. And even though the global share has reduced, especially for North America, we can see that it's not yet at the same level than the number of vessels. Southeast Asia, even though they have almost half of the global fishing fleet, represent only a quarter of the engine power. Latin America, which does not have that many vessels, has quite an important part of the engine power. So these changes actually are in part due to the changes in the artisanal fleet and especially the motorization. As you can see in the 50s, very, very little portion, about 15% of the artisanal fleet was motorized, while nowadays it's more than 2/3. And the average engine power of the artisanal fleet keeps on increasing. That and the increase in general of the industrial fleet has led to a massive decrease in global catch per unit of effort. And efforts, I'll come back to that, but using a mix of effort, which is a mix of the engine power and the time spent at sea. It's a composite proxy, but basically, since 1970, we can see that the global CPUE has decreased almost linearly by close to 30%. But unfortunately, that's not the whole picture. If we consider also the effect of technology in the catch per unit of effort, we realize that it has decreased at a much faster rate than that. Over 80% decrease in CPUE since the 70s. So that is considering that the technology has vastly improved since then. This decrease has been relatively, always been seen throughout the world, with some countries that are doing, some regions that are doing a bit better, some regions that are doing a bit worse. You'll notice here Latin America that's doing this big peak, but that's mostly because of the inshore relata in the 60s. But as a general picture, the global CPUE has decreased, except maybe in Europe, where it has started to kind of level up. Now, to really go back into what's interesting here, and that's all the different exceptions and the effect on the effect of the different exceptions on the global fishing fleet. About 87% of the fishing fleet, or 3 million, is artisanal, but only 43% of the engine power, of the global engine power, is considered artisanal. So there's quite a difference between the two. When we actually try to spread that over the different categories of countries, we can see that the developing countries as per the WTO definition, take the biggest share in the number of artisanal vessels, which is, number of vessels, which is about 80% of the world fleet is artisanal fleet from the developing countries. These vessels, however, have a relatively small portion, only 1/3 of the global fishing fleet. Considering the least developed countries, it's even more obvious. About 7% of the global fishing, or of the fleet of the least developed countries. The least developed countries account for about 7% of the global fishing fleet, and there's very little difference between artisan and industrial, because there's very few industrial vessels in these countries. And comparatively in power, it's about 2% of the engine power of the world, 3% if we include the industrial as well. Now, looking at the exceptions that was considering fishing in and out of the EEZ, we can see that the vast majority of the fishing of the fleet fishes in the EEZ, mostly because they are artisanal in nature, which can be compared to how much is fished by the developed countries or outside of the EEZ. So we can see that roughly 58% of the global fishing effort is done by developing countries in the EEZ, with an extra 15% outside of the EEZ, usually in neighboring countries, and only 27%, a bit less than a third, are done by developed countries, including China in that one. For the developer countries, that's including in and out of the EEZ. So going back to the first graphs and the developing countries, I'm just focusing a bit more about that. So altogether, we can consider that the whole fishing fleet, 76%, so over 2/3 of the global fishing fleet of the world fish in the EEZ, with only 22% outside of the EEZ and very, very few from non-WTO members. Looking a bit more into detail into the social and economics of these countries, the biggest part of the fishing effort, as I said in a previous graph, is done by the developing world inside the EEZ. So that's over half of that. I'm realizing the number of times, so I'm just going to go quickly through that. And most of this fishing effort actually is done by Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Indian Peninsula, which together accounts for more than 40% of the global fishing effort.
Yannick, apologies for interrupting. Please don't be too worried about time, because there's a lot of detail in these. So if you'd like to spend a little bit of time talking through them, please do. I'm struggling to keep up with my notes, so don't feel too.
Sorry, I have the tendency to speak fast, and I know how boring all these numbers can be. So I'll get back to the very last slide on all of this to just do a summary of the main numbers, but. Basically, it's to say that the effort, the fishing fleet effort of the developing countries in the EEZ accounts for quite a substantial amount of the total fishing effort of the world, even though that might not translate into catch as the previous presenters were talking about. And actually, when including the catch in that and looking at the catch per unit of effort of the developing countries, we can actually see that it has decreased substantially since the 70s, perhaps even more than globally. That said, these numbers are to be taken very, very, very carefully, because quite a lot of what we consider now developing countries had a certain amount of geopolitical events happening to them, in particular, all the independence from European countries, separation, splitting, regrouping, and things like that. So the catch per unit of effort of these countries prior to the 70s cannot really be taken to like at words, as there's quite a lot of changes, as you can see in this graph. However, since the 70s, we can see the catch per unit of effort, like globally, has decreased substantially, even more so when we consider the technological change. And that's very close to 90% drop in CPUE, which is considerable. And now that's where I'm going to spend a bit more time just doing a summary of what I just presented and just hammering some interesting points home. Is that firstly, the artisanal fleet of the world is the lion's share of the number of vessels. Out of the 3.5 or so million vessels in the world, 87% of the fishing fleet is artisanal in terms of number of vessels. But it does not translate in the engine power. As Anthony was saying, they're usually quite small. And in this case, about 43% of the global engine power is actually artisanal. However, with technology that keeps on improving and the fact that there is about 1 million vessels which are unmotorized nowadays, there is a potential for that share in engine power to increase substantially in the next 10 years. That has contributed to the global decrease in CPUE, and there is very little, relatively very little difference regionally or by type of countries, whether developing or developed, in the decrease in CPUE. Everybody is on the same boat, no pun intended. Now, focusing a bit more on the exceptions, the developing countries account for very close to 80% of the global fishing fleet of the world and about a third of the engine power, while the least developed countries are a relatively small portion, 7% of vessels and 2 to 3% in engine power, depending if we include the industrial, which are usually trawlers. Most of the fishing effort over the world happens in the EZ of their own countries, and particularly in the developing countries where close to 80% of the effort is in the EZ, with the rest usually being in neighboring countries. And there was a lot of data, so feel free to ask questions away. I know that it can be quite dense, especially when I speak. So thank you very much for listening to me.
No, well, Yannick, thank you very, very much indeed for all of this work that's gone into this presentation. What I'm going to try and do now, everyone, with your indulgence, because I know we're running short of time, is to give you, and of course we'll be sharing these, is to give you, because there's been so much data today, is to give you a sense of what we feel are some of the key takeaways. And then we actually have a little table that Tristan has spent a lot of time preparing, which summarizes the points of data that we've heard today alongside the various exceptions that we're currently looking at in the text. So before I go through that, some very general key takeaways. We've heard this from Yannick in particular, and also from Deng. Global catch has gradually been decreasing since the late 1990s, but it's interestingly, artisanal catch, at least as a proportion, has also been increasing. We've seen fishing capacity of the global fleet significantly expanding, with a particularly large increase in Southeast Asia, and particularly driven by the expansion of powered artisanal vessels. So gradually we see unpowered, unmotorized artisanal vessels being converted into motorized artisanal vessels. So alongside this expansion, we've seen the global catch per unit of effort declining significantly, either measured by nominal catch per unit of effort or effective. When we look specifically at subsidies, and this was in Anna's presentation, artisanal fishing receives around 1/5 of global fisheries subsidies in total. And of course, messages that we already know, capacity enhancing subsidies represent the majority of subsidies provided to both artisanal and industrial fishing. A couple of important points, not so much about the exceptions, but in particular about some of the rules we're considering in Article 5. On fishing effort in areas beyond national jurisdiction, fishing on the high seas is about 14% of large-scale effort. Remember, this is Anthony's data, so it's Global Fishing Watch. It's about 14% of large-scale fishing in terms of hours, about 23% of that larger-scale fishing in terms of kilowatt hours. If we consider the high seas and foreign EEZs, so that's one of the two areas beyond national jurisdiction rules. What scale of fishing are we talking about in terms of large-scale fishing? We're talking about 25% or so of the hours of large-scale fishing are spent either on the high seas or in foreign EEZs, and about 40% or so of kilowatt hours of that large-scale fishing spent on the high seas and in foreign EEZs. So that gives you a sense of, at least for large-scale fishing, how the two options for subsidies, for prohibition on subsidies to fishing in areas beyond national jurisdiction, what sort of scope they might have, at least for the large-scale fishing. So I'm going to attempt now to work my way through this table relatively quickly, and we will be circulating this once we've spoken also to the speakers about exactly how public they would like their information to be. So we've heard a number of different points of data on LDC fishing. So we've seen from the Global Fishing Watch data, from Anthony's data, that fishing under the flag of LDC WTO members represents 0.7% of global AIS tracked fishing effort in terms of hours, and almost 1%, but still very little, in terms of kilowatt hours. The catch that Deng presented indicates that the fleets of LDC WTO members account for some 6.8% of global catch by tonnage. And Anna Schubauer's data, which we saw in the video, indicates that LDC members account for maybe 1.7% of global fisheries subsidies based on the UBC data. If we look only at the kinds of subsidies that are likely to be covered by WTO rules, and in particular by 5.1. If we look at the territorial sea of developing country members, again, the Global Fishing Watch data indicates that fishing under the flag of developing country WTO members in their own territorial seas makes up around 20% of AIS tracked data in terms of fishing hours, and about half of that, say 10%, in terms of kilowatt hours. And that difference might be explained by the fact that we have relatively less powerful vessels, even those tracked by AIS in developing countries. So we heard from Deng, we don't have global catch data on fishing in the territorial sea, so that's 12 nautical miles from shore, but Deng was able to give us catch data on fishing in inshore fishing areas. This is larger than the territorial sea. It's about 50 kilometers offshore, or up to 200 meters of depth, whatever comes first. And this data shows us that catch by the fleets of developing country WTO members in their inshore fishing areas, a slightly larger concept than a territorial sea, but it accounts for around 21% of global catch. And it's important to remember that if we're looking only at the territorial sea, this number is going to be lower, obviously, but it could, we think, give a useful indicative benchmark of the amount of catch, at least in terms of volume, that we're talking about. If we think about the combination of an exception for subsidies to fishing in territorial seas of developing country members and EEZs of developing country members, except for China, we look back at the Global Fishing Watch data, and that indicates that fishing under the flag of developing country WTO members in their own territorial seas plus EEZs represents some 26% of AIS tracked fishing effort in terms of hours, and some 18% in terms of actual kilowatt hours. So the catch data from the University of British Columbia, again, shows that catch by the fleets of WTO, of developing country members, except for China, in their EEZs, accounts for some 42% of global catch, at least in terms of volume. Now, one important note is that 42% doesn't include catch by China in its territorial sea. If we include that, this is the second figure here, so that if we include China's catch in its EEZ, that gives us an amount of about 49% of global catch by tonnage. So that's if we were covering all developing country territorial seas and all developing country EEZs, including China. This gives us, I think, a sense of kind of a useful upper limit of the scope of this potential exception, at least in terms of catch. And again, you know, if we move to Yannick Rousseau's data, you know, we can see that effort by the fleets of developing countries, except for China, in their own EEZ accounts for about 58% of global fishing effort. And again, that number doesn't include fishing effort by China's fleet within its own domestic territorial sea, although this fishing would be covered by this combined exception. So according to this data, the share of global fishing effort that would be excluded by this combined exception is probably somewhat higher than 58%. But we're not exactly, we can't give you a precise number. This is the best I think we can come up with. If we look specifically at artisanal, and there's an important note here that the way artisanal fishing is defined varies between the different studies, but we can see that it's not relevant to Anthony's data. Of course, as we've discussed, Anthony's data considers not artisanal fishing, but larger scale fishing. So we start with the catch data from the University of British Columbia, and that indicates that around 22% of global catch comes from the artisanal sector by volume. And if we look at fishing capacity, the share of the artisanal sector is considerably more important. This is what we could see in Yannick's data. So that indicates that the artisanal sector represents some 87 or so % of the total number of fishing vessels and some 43% of the total engine power of the global fishing fleet. Anna showed us a little bit what this means in terms of subsidies, and this might come to your question, Michelle. So the artisanal fleet receives around 11% of fisheries subsidies that we think will likely be covered by the WTO rules. And so, you know, while it's clear that artisanal fishing represents a smaller but not insignificant share of global catch and global subsidies, its share of global fishing effort is quite considerable. And we think this probably also points to the fact that the artisanal sector employs such a large number of fish workers worldwide. If we move, and I'm conscious of time here, if we move to a focus specifically on artisanal fishing as defined in the different studies, and not in a comparable way, but artisanal fishing within developing country WTO members. So we're moving here from artisanal for everyone to artisanal just for developing countries. The percentages obviously decrease somewhat. So the catch data from the UBC indicates that some 15% of total global catch comes from the artisanal sector in developing countries. If you look at fishing capacity, the artisanal sector in developing countries represents slightly less, some 78% of the total number of fishing vessels, some 34% of total engine power. And again, Anna's data indicates that artisanal vessels in developing, or artisanal fleets in developing country WTO members receive some 5% of the fisheries subsidies, according to Rashid's data, that we think are likely to be most likely captured in a WTO agreement. So this is, I'm conscious, an extremely quick review of quite a comprehensive and relatively complicated table. If you have kind of particular quick questions or additional things that you wanted to add or ask at this point, please go ahead, but I'm conscious that I'm afraid I've already taken us over time, but I'm happy to answer kind of immediate questions now. And of course, to talk to you all about the table once we've been able to circulate it in more detail, because I think it'll be an interesting one for everyone. But if there are immediate reactions or questions, please do put them now if you have the time. I'm conscious this might take some time to absorb. Perhaps I've overwhelmed you. Fair enough. I can't see any immediate questions or comments, but I will give you a few more seconds if you're writing in the chat box. And I apologize for taking you over time. If there's nothing immediate, I don't see anything immediate. I'm conscious this may require some time to for you to digest and develop and work out what your questions are. Perhaps then I'll get in some of my concluding comments at this point. But of course, while if you are still writing, please finish your question and we'll take it if we possibly can. But essentially, as you can see here, what we've tried to do is to gather from different data sources, non-comparable data sources, because that's all we have at this point, but different data sources, data that can give us a sense of the potential scope of some of these exceptions. Now, and as Malik quite rightly pointed out at the beginning, this is data about fisheries catch, this is the data about effort, this is the data about numbers of vessels. Apart from Anna's data, this is all just about the fishing activity that a particular exception might cover. Now, we cannot tell you precisely what the impact of a particular subsidy prohibition will be in a particular area yet, but this we thought would help to give you a sense of scope and a sense of scale of the kinds of fishing we're talking about, so that as you look through the exceptions, you can get a sense of how much actual fishing activity in the real world we're thinking of covering in terms of a subsidy exception. So we hope it's useful. What we're going to do next is we're going to go back to each of our presenters to double check with them, because to be honest, they have been working up till right now to produce all of this data. So we are going to double check with them precisely how far they would like it publicized. And once we have that and we can give you clear guidelines, we'll put all of the data together in a little package, including perhaps a video, the link to the video of the presentation that I gave yesterday on the state of play, if that's useful, and a compilation of the slides and information that the presenters are happy to have transmitted to you, with any caveats that they would like to apply as to how it's used. And as diplomats, I'm sure none of that will come as a surprise to you. I can't see any questions in the chat, so I'm conscious there will probably be a range that come to us in the next few weeks, which is good. We very much hope you found this useful. Sincere thanks to Yannick, who's still with us, but also to Anna and to Anthony and Deng, who I suspect have already gratefully gone to bed. But we'll be sharing this with you as soon as we have tidied it up and turned it into a good package for you. We hope it's been useful, and we'll be sending it out with our usual request for feedback. As a reminder, all of this work that we do is funded by the PUE Charitable Trusts and by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. So for those of you who didn't hear me say this yesterday, I'll say it again. We are here and we are funded to support you all in these negotiations, and in also considering the directions for reform of your own fisheries subsidies domestically. So please consider us a resource. We're able, as we've done here, to connect you to scientists who can give you a sense of the reality of fishing, which is in the end of the day the industry we're trying to help to move onto a more sustainable footing with these rules. So please don't hesitate to reach out. If you haven't got my email address, you'll have it at the end of the email that we sent to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. We hope this has been useful, and best of luck for the rest of the negotiations. And please don't hesitate to reach out if you have specific questions about this presentation or questions more general questions about the negotiations themselves. So apart from that, I will stop sharing my screen now and just leave it to